This is part 3 of the read-along for Unit 3.12, Late 19th Century Painting and Sculpture. The Bergers. For the Bergers of Calais, Rodin relied on his imagination as well as historical accounts of the event to present each figure as a complex, conflicted individual expressing a mix of emotions. Instead of presenting proud, stoic heroes unified in their cause, Rodin portrays each man in an isolated moment of personal contemplation. To see an audiovisual presentation of this sculpture, select Art Lecture, Bergers of Calais. To see a slideshow presentation, explore Bergers of Calais on the next screen. So, Rodin, to make this sculpture, relied on his imagination, and he also relied on texts from history. And he wanted to show each individual as a person who is complex and conflicted and having a mix of emotions, instead of showing them as really proud, stoic, meaning not having a strong emotional response. Heroes unified in their cause, so he didn't want to show them sort of walking out, heads held really high, very proud of what they were doing, unemotional. He portrays each man in an isolated moment of personal contemplation. So he's trying to show that each of these men feels sort of isolated and on his own, even though he's part of a group, and in a moment of personal contemplation. So they're all very thoughtful. They're thinking about what they're doing, thinking about their lives, thinking about the fact that they're about to be executed. That's what he's trying to show in this Bergers of Calais sculpture. Here we can see some images of the sculpture. Rodin depicts Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the leader of the group, in a vulnerable pose with his shoulders slumped forward. He was the first Berger to volunteer his life. Standing upright with his head held high in quiet defiance, Jean Dare grasps one of the keys to Calais. He was the second citizen to volunteer his life, so there's that key to the city that he's holding. Rodin depicts Pierre de Wissant with more emotion and less defiance. His head is turned to the side in despair, while his arm is raised to shield his face. So he's sort of feeling a deep sadness about what's going on, and his arm is kind of up to cover his face. Here's another view of the Bergers of Calais. You can see this man sort of covering his head and his face. Here they are holding the keys to the city. You can see the noose around the neck of the Bergers. What emotion do you think Rodin portrayed in the figure of Andrew d'Andrés with his face buried in his hands? Jean de Fien stands with arms extended and mouth agape. So his arm is extended, his mouth is agape or open. And Rodin exaggerated the proportions in each of the figures. He lengthened the arms and made each man's hands and feet much larger in proportion than the rest of his body, as Michelangelo did in his David. What expressive quality do you think that the enlarged hands add to the sculpture? So the sculpture shows men with hands that are way bigger than they would have been in real life, and this is something that Rodin picked up from Michelangelo on that trip to Italy. What do you think he was able to express by having hands that were enlarged? What do you think that adds to the expressiveness of the sculpture? Rodin's expressive figures. Unlike his Renaissance predecessors, who chiseled and then polished rough marble to a smooth finish, Rodin first modeled his figures in clay and later had them cast in bronze. He used his fingers to render expressive variations in texture that captured the effects of light as it raked across the body. The visible fingerprints that Rodin left in the clay show how he worked, and also add movement and tension to the figure's muscles, which he hoped would ultimately capture the person's inner emotions. So unlike his Renaissance predecessors, or the people who came before him, who chiseled and then polished rough marble to a smooth finish, Rodin modeled his figures in clay and later had them cast in bronze. So he made these sculptures out of clay, and then through a process of mold making, he would take the clay sculptures and have them sort of converted into bronze, which is a type of metal. He used his fingers to render expressive variations in the texture that captured the effects of light as it raked across the body. And so instead of using all clay tools in his sculptures, he used his fingers a lot, and we can still see the fingerprints that he left in his sculptures. And this is part of how Rodin made his figures so expressive. So these fingerprints that are showing up in these statues are sort of like the short expressive brushstrokes that we saw in the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters, and in the paintings of Edvard Munch that we saw earlier in this unit. This is the sculpture equivalent of those short brushstrokes that we've seen from the painters. Rodin worked with several different foundries to create molds of his clay sculpture and then cast them in bronze. The molds could be used multiple times. This enabled Rodin to create many copies of the same sculpture. Currently, there are at least 11 known casts of Bergers of Calais. Do you think that a sculpture is more or less valuable if there is more than one original? Why? So, Rodin worked with several different foundries. Foundries are places that make objects out of metal. And he worked with several different foundries to create molds of his clay sculpture and then had them cast in bronze. So he took his clay sculptures to different places to get molds made and to have the sculptures converted into metal sculptures from clay. The molds that he had made could be used more than once, and so he was able to make more than one of this sculpture. So again, up here we're talking about his Renaissance predecessors who took a piece of marble and they chiseled it with a hammer and chisel, and then polished it until it's a smooth, shiny surface. And you can only do that once. Every marble sculpture is an original. This process that Rodin was using meant that he could have more than one copy of his sculpture. Right now we know of at least 11 known casts of Bergers of Calais. So he has at least 11 copies of this sculpture in the world. And do we think that that makes it more valuable that there's more than one, or less valuable since there's more than one? What do you guys think? Response to Bergers of Calais. The civic leaders of Calais were appalled at Rodin's rendering of the important event that they sought to memorialize. They expected a monumental sculpture depicting bravely posed heroes set high on a pedestal. Instead, Rodin provided them with his own painfully realistic interpretation of the events. So, the civic leaders, meaning the leaders of the city of Calais, were appalled. They were horrified. They were disgusted at Rodin's rendering of the important event that they sought to memorialize. So they wanted a memorial to these men who they thought of as very brave and very proud. And his rendering, or his way of showing these people, did not match up to the memorial that they wanted. They wanted a monumental sculpture depicting bravely posed heroes set high on a pedestal, and instead Rodin gave them his own painfully realistic interpretation of the events. So He read the accounts of what happened. He imagined what it would actually look like for these men who had been trapped in a city that was being starved slowly, how they would really look to come out of that city after being stuck for a year, when the King of England is asking them to dress in humble clothes so they're draped in cheap burlap. Um, and he wanted to show them realistically and them contemplating the fact that they're about to be put to death. And the leaders of Calais wanted proud heroes, and that's not what they feel like he delivered. To make matters worse, Rodin mounted the figures close to the ground on a low base, so close that the viewer was nearly eye level with the bergers. Rodin wanted to convey the idea that everyday citizens are capable of committing heroic acts. So the leaders of Calais wanted these guys high up on a pedestal so that when you look at this sculpture, you're looking up at them. You're looking up in wonder and admiration at these heroes that are up on this high pedestal. And Rodin said, no, I'm going to put them down low to the ground, almost equal with the viewer, so that I can show that even everyday people can be heroes. You don't have to be this sort of elevated person. You don't have to be high up on a pedestal to be a real life hero. Ultimately, response to Bergers of Calais was so negative that the commissioners installed it in a remote area and placed it high upon a pedestal far from view. So they put it in a remote area, meaning sort of an isolated area that not a lot of people went to, and they put it high up on a pedestal so that it was hard for people to really see the details of the sculpture that Rodin had made. Rodin's influence on modern sculpture was significant. His groundbreaking use of the low pedestal enabled 20th century, 1900s artists to break free from the tradition of exhibiting sculpture on pedestals and paved the way for creation of three-dimensional works that interact with the viewer's space. So he was the first one to kind of come along and say, hey, we don't have to put our sculptures high up on a pedestal where they're hard to see and kind of elevated above people. We can make sculptures that exist in the people's space, that they can interact with, that they can be on the same level with. So this was another big new idea from Rodin, the father of expressive sculpture.